Welcome back. Yeltsin's presidency saw a Russia plagued by instability and high unemployment following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Today, Russia continues to struggle with this legacy. Organised crime's rife, the murder rate amongst the worst in the world, 20 per 100,000, and that is 3 times that of the United States. The conflict in Chechnya continues. Thousands have been killed. Reports of wide-scale human rights abuses, including disappearances, continue to tarnish Russia's image. Also, relations with some of its former Soviet neighbours are still poor. In January 2006, Moscow temporarily cut gas supplies to the Ukraine. Nevertheless, not all of the news is bleak. Economic growth is strong at more than 6%, and that is the strongest amongst the G8 countries. Politically, Russia's playing an important role on the Iranian nuclear issue and on the North Korean crisis. We're joined again by our guest from Moscow, Dimitri Babbage, a leading journalist and political analyst who writes for Russia Profile, and from London, Martin McCauley, a specialist in Russian history and politics, the author of numerous studies on Russia and the Soviet Union. Martin McCauley, if I could come to you first of all. In his resignation speech at New Year's Eve 1999, he asked for forgiveness. What was Yeltsin asking to be forgiven for?
That he'd promised Russians everything and delivered very little. The Russians had hoped in 1991 they were entering a new era. They were promised a market economy. Democracy means you'll become rich and powerful, and people had far-fetched ideas of what would happen. They thought they would become very rich very quickly, that a market economy would in fact progress very quickly. Unfortunately, they found that a market economy is very difficult to bring into being and to function very, very well, because it requires institutions, requires the rule of law, and so on. And basically what Yeltsin was saying in 1999, we've tried, we've done our best, we're only 1 or 2 paces along the road to a market economy and democracy and to making Russia rich and powerful again. But because he couldn't know that in a very short time oil and gas prices would go through the roof and commodity prices would rise, so that Russia now is richer than it has been for a very long time. And if you like, if you look at the economic indices, it's back at the 1989 level, and that the country has plenty large reserves of dollars and currency and so on. So Russia seems to have turned the corner now. Yeltsin in many ways was unlucky during the 1990s. Commodity prices were low, oil and gas prices were low, and he could point to that and say, I was unlucky, I also got very bad advice, very poor advice.
And Martin, let's bring in Dimitri Babbage at this particular point. And Yeltsin also said he said when he resigned, he believed, I have done my job. What did he think his job had been?
I think the very fact that he asked for forgiveness was very touching, because normally Russian rulers never ask for forgiveness, and he was the first one to do it. And as for hopes associated with him, you know, maybe some people hoped that they would get rich very quickly in 1991, but I remember even more people being afraid that they would die of hunger next winter, and that didn't happen. So that was the main part of Yeltsin's job. The food problem, which was very acute in 1989, 1990, 1991, it got a little, you know, less severe by the mid-90s. And certainly, if you look at Moscow today, and if you look at pictures of Moscow in 1989, you will see that we are not at the same level.
One writer in 1994, one writer put down these words. He laid the foundations for geopolitical, economic and social structure in Russia that will either be reinforced or destroyed in the next phase of transition. Has that phase of transition been reached?
Well, I would say that he did lay some foundations of our political system. It may not be an ideal political system. A lot of people criticize it. Everything is basically decided by the president now. Parties and parliament have only marginal role to play. But unfortunately, when we had a full-fledged parliament until 1993, it led to a lot of conflicts between the president and the parliament, something that is now happening in Ukraine. So I don't see how else he could form the political system in Russia. And, you know, it was a unique experiment. No one transformed from socialism back to capitalism, and no one, at no time in its history, was Russia basically a Russian state. It was always an empire comprising many ethnic entities, and now we have a state where 85% of the population is Russian.
What would he make of the Russia of 2007, the Russia of Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think that Russia today, in the year 2007, it may not be a very well-developed country. It's certainly not a West European or North American country, but it's not a country of the third world neither. And, you know, there are certain successes have been achieved since Yeltsin quit. I heard recently you said that thousands have been killed in Chechnya. No, thousands were killed in Chechnya during the 90s. Now there are dozens killed, which is also a tragedy. And of course, the rulers of Chechnya currently breach human rights. But this is a far cry from what we had in 1994.
Martin Macaulay, Boris Yeltsin, good or bad for Russia?
He was good for Russia in the beginning. His legacy will be, he was the man who buried communism. He ended the rule of the Communist Party. He was very, very important for that. There was certain animus between him and the Communist Party because of the way the party had treated him in 1989 and afterwards. And he had it in for Gorbachev. And because of that, he really hammered the Communist Party, and the Communist Party never came back to power in the 1990s. Even though the majority of citizens voted for the communists, they wanted the communists to come back because they didn't like what was happening in the 1990s. That was good. He laid the foundations of the institutions. You can criticize him in 1992 for not going for a constitution and not going for a new parliament. Had he gone for a new parliament in 1992, the Democratic Russia and the other liberals and Democrats would have been in the majority, and he would have had a much easier ride. But he didn't want a parliament to do that, and therefore you can blame him for that.
And Dimitri Babbage, the same question for you. Boris Yeltsin, good or bad for Russia?
I think he was both. He was both good and bad, but in any way he was great. I mean, it's the same thing as answering a question, was de Gaulle good or bad for France? He was sometimes good, sometimes bad, but anyway, he was great.
A very interesting man, nonetheless, and to his death, in many ways, also an enigma. Did many people understand him?
I don't think so, because Yeltsin, especially in the second half of the 1990s, was very hard to understand because his utterances were difficult to interpret and so on. That was because of his health, because of his heart condition and so on. And therefore, the Yeltsin of the 1989 to 1991 period, 1992 period, was much easier to understand because he was a great populist. And he had this relationship with the people, which Gorbachev lacked, and which was outstanding in his case. But from the mid-1990s onwards, he more or less became separated from the people and so on, lost that contact because of his health and so on. So, if you like, he is an enigma, and perhaps he should have gone in 1996, but of course there was nobody really of his stature, a Democrat of his stature, to take over, so he had to stay.
Martin Macaulay in London, thank you very much for your thoughts. Dimitri Babbage also joining us from Moscow, thank you very much too, for talking about Boris Yeltsin. Controversial, colourful, cunning, a man that the world and his people will never forget, but also perhaps looking at these pictures and remembering his life as a personality and as a politician, perhaps a man that the world didn't understand or really know. You've been watching Inside Story. Thanks for joining us.